Hello. So today we are going to be talking about exploring literature's pages 21 through 34, as well as a little bit of 1273 to 1275. And that is the personal response essay. And that is going to lead us into our first essay of the semester. So the goal in this chapter is to develop your initial responses into an essay about literature. We begin by emphasizing the personal essay, but the habits of thinking and writing stressed in this chapter actually apply equally well to the argumentative essay explored in later chapters. So the skills that we learn here will not just be for this essay. You'll be using some of the comparative ideas, using two pieces together in essays going forward. So we want to think about how to find our writing voice. That is related back to what we talked about before, taking your first response and then being able to analyze that and being able to articulate that into an essay. Developing a clear thesis statement, making sure that we have a strong statement in there that explains in one sentence what our opinion is of the piece or pieces we're writing about, as well as how that relates to our own experiences. Also, showing what we mean through detail, illustration, and comparison. And then citing evidence, so using quotes from the text itself. So the purpose of a personal essay is to share our experience. That's from page 21 of the book. In the personal response essay, we're showing commonalities between the themes we read about and our own experiences. So now that you've read a few of the poems and can relate to some of them, and we do some of that practice in our journals, we kind of want to think about how we might be able to flesh that out and elaborate on it in order to make a longer essay. There is also a checklist, so when you're writing your personal response essay, try to look at that checklist on page 22 of the Exploring Literature textbook. So let's talk a little bit about voice and staying anchored in the literature. We want to think about showing, not telling. And this is a quote from the book. We are not likely to settle for being told an issue is compelling or trivial. We want to be moved by the issue, to present at the event, to know the characters for ourselves. So we want to be able to show from the text how this experience relates to ours. Use descriptions, narration, and evidence from the text and evidence from your own experiences in order to show the connection for your readers. So it's not just enough to say, when the person in the poem felt alienated, it reminded me of a time in my life when I felt alienated. You'll have to use examples from both in order to show how they are similar to each other. A way to do that is to write to describe. That means use of both objective and subjective description. So you might be asking what the difference is between objective and subjective description. So objective description is summary. It shows details without personal attachment or bias from the reader. And here's an example. There were icicles on the trees and the ground was covered in snow. She smiled. It's basically just summarizing or describing what is happening. Subjective description shows the author's feelings, biases, and attitudes toward the subject being described. I was miserable as I stood shivering in the icicle and snow-covered landscape. She smiled the most radiant smile I had ever seen. Notice that the subjective description tells you how the author is feeling, tells you how the author feels about the smile, and describes more of the author's own internal feelings about the scene rather than just giving a description. An effective description is much more than a summary. A summary has no voice. An engaging description has our voice, impressions, and feelings as well as relevant details. So in order to write an effective description of something, you'll need to include both objective and subjective details. A good way to do this is to use sense words. And what I mean by sense words is when you're writing about descriptions, you want to call upon your own senses in order to recall what you were feeling at that time. So if I'm describing a city street or a person or an object, I want to ask myself, what does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? What does it feel like? Now, you may not use all 5 of these, and if you're describing like a busy New York street, I suggest you don't tell me what it tastes like and you don't try to find out how it tastes. But instead, if you're describing the New York City street was busy, well, that's an objective description. But if you say, the building seemed to stretch on and tower over me, I heard the sounds of traffic and construction work and people talking on their phones, I could smell the pizza being made across the street, I could feel the hard pavement underneath my feet and against my shoulders as I leaned against the building. All of those sense words help to give your reader a more complete picture of your description. Including as many of these details as possible will ensure a more complete overall impression. So writing to compare. Comparing and contrasting are natural ways to describe our responses to literature. We might compare ourselves to others with others with literary characters, or only experiences with those in a work of literature. We may compare the choices made by various characters with the choices we would make. So you do have a choice here. You're going to be thinking about, in an essay, do I want to write about my own experiences in comparison to the experiences of a character or an author? Or do I want to take 2 authors or 2 characters from 2 different works and compare them to each other? You want to ask yourself certain questions, right? How are the experiences of the characters similar to our own? How are they different? How many points of commonality can I find? How many points of difference? So, are you writing a comparison, which is about similarities, or a contrast, which is about differences? Are you discussing yourself and a character or author, or are you describing 2 different characters or 2 different authors? It's kind of going to depend on what you feel like writing about and what you feel like you have enough material to write about. Finally, you have to ask yourself, could these points support a thesis? That means, do I have enough material here to write a solid essay? Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And so it's always good to know that before you start so you don't have to get halfway through and realize that maybe you need to start over. A good way to look at this is something called a Venn diagram. A Venn diagram is a good visual tool to help you generate and organize your ideas. So here's an example of a Venn diagram. You have here one circle that is different ideas or events of number 1. So the first poem or story you've decided you want to write about, you think about different ideas that you want to discuss about that story. And then over in the second circle here, you have different ideas or events of number 2. That's possibly your own experiences if you're writing a personal response or a reader-based response, or it could be a second story or poem if you've decided you're going to do a text-based response and compare 2 pieces to each other. So you've got your 2 pieces, and then in the middle here, this is where the 2 circles intersect. You have similar ideas and events of number 1 and number 2. That's where the commonality is. So if I'm writing about 2 different poems, I might say here in this middle area, these are the points where these poems have similarities, and that's what I'm going to discuss in my essay. So reader-based criticism versus text-based criticism. Reader-based criticism is generally subjective, right? So the basic premise of reader-based or reader response critical theory is that the literature does not exist separate from those who read it. Readers are encouraged to respond personally to literature and to think about the ways their backgrounds influence their responses and to support their responses with reference to the literature itself. So that is comparing your own experiences and showing how they are similar to the experiences of the piece that you're reading. You notice circle 1 is the story or poem you're using. Circle 2 is your own experiences, and the commonalities are in the middle. Text-based criticism is objective. As the designation formalism suggests, this approach closely examines the elements of form and structure and language, such as genre, plot, characterization, narration, tone, irony, diction, imagery, metaphor, and symbol. You can use any of those. You don't have to use them all, you can just pick out certain ones. A formalist critic constructs meaning by focusing exclusively on the elements of the text, and they weigh the work together to form a unified, coherent whole. So in this case, what you're doing is you're taking two different stories or two different poems and pointing out your commonalities. You're not using your own experiences in a text-based criticism. You're only discussing two pieces and how they relate to each other. So to review, personal response essays show commonality between experiences and themes in literature and our own experiences. The Venn diagram is a good visual tool to help you generate and organize your ideas. When brainstorming your essay, think about whether you want to use reader-based or text-based criticism. Try not to use both. Think about consciously making a choice between one or the other. And finally, when writing your essay, remember to use both objective and subjective descriptions because you don't necessarily need to use them all the time, both in one essay, but you want to have a handle on both so you know when to use each one and when they are appropriate. That is all for this lecture. Thanks so much for listening and take care, everyone.